anything that people didn't want, they generally disposed of it by dumping it into water. And as villages became towns and towns became cities, many rivers became open sewers. And with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, some very nasty chemicals were added to the mix, and water quality generally across England and Wales plummeted to untold depths. But in recent decades, massive investments have been made, particularly by the water companies, and that has seen a real shift in water quality improvements, particularly for point sources from sewage treatment works and industrial outfalls. But it is still widely recognised that diffuse pollution is the biggest problem that we have to deal with in England and Wales. And the National Audit Office recently undertook an estimate to say that the cumulative cost, did I say that right, the cumulative cost of dealing with diffuse pollution is likely to be somewhere between 700 million and 1.3 billion pounds per year. And this is likely to increase with the impacts of climate change and an increasing population. So to put it into some sort of context, from the Environment Agency, we deal with managing the impacts on water bodies. Now, this is just a landscape representation of all the water bodies that might exist. So we've got groundwater, and where this impacts on the surface and there's dependent ecosystems, you'll have wetlands, there's rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters. They are all of interest for us in managing the impacts on particular water bodies, but we also have to consider artificial and heavily modified water bodies, including canals, ports, and flood defences and reservoirs. Now, in England and Wales, there are 8,000 or so of these water bodies within 11 river basin districts. These river basin districts can be broken down into 100 principal catchments, and all of these water bodies, when each of these catchments has to now achieve new, stricter standards under a statutory driver called the Water Framework Directive that comes out of Europe and drills all the way down to every water body. Now, what the Water Framework Directive provides is an adaptive management framework for 6-year cycles of plan, do, check, review. Each of these 6-year cycles must understand what are the problems, what are the solutions to those problems, and what are the predicted outcomes, and who will deliver them. Now, the first cycle started in 2009 to 2015. We're in the middle of the planning, doing stage for that now, but we've just entered the planning stage for the second cycle, which is 2015 to 2021. Now, the Water Framework Directive insists that we must achieve good status in every one of those 8,000 or so water bodies by 2027, according to a range of biological, physical, and chemical parameters. What it sets out is a new, stricter way of measuring our progress towards achieving good status. So we have to produce statutory documents in each one of those 6-year cycles, the first of which is a working together document, how we will go about engaging with the community who have an interest in any one of those water bodies. And we launched on the 22nd of June the working together consultation for the second cycle of river basin management planning. That then leads us to identifying what are the scenario options for addressing the significant water management issues to help us understand the community's mandate for determining strategic priorities in each one of the river basin management plans in each of those river basin districts. That will then set out what are the local delivery priorities in every one of the river basin district water bodies. This has to be underpinned by sound science informing regulatory policy and determining what works as a practical implementation in the field. Now, to help understand and translate the science policy practice continuum, there is a framework called the Pressure State Response Framework. So whatever pressures that humans exert on the environment, it will impact on the state or condition of a water body, and then society will respond accordingly with a policy remit, new advanced technology, or some other function that they know best will deliver the local solution. There is also what is known as the Source Pathway Receptor Framework. there are many sources of pollutants. The usual suspects, the 3 Cs, chemicals, cows and concrete. You guys here today are more interested in the concrete end of the spectrum from a highways perspective. And the Environment Agency deals with the point sources through its permitting system, but addressing diffuse sources is particularly difficult. And a lot of these diffuse sources are detergents or other toxic materials that people tend to pour down the drain, runoff from farmland and agricultural activities, and the reason why we're here today is runoff from roads and highways. Now, individually, each one of these may have a minimal impact, but together their impact can be quite devastating on wildlife and habitats. Now, given the scale of diffuse pollution problems, the government has given a new steer to address this, recognising that no one organisation can address this on their own, and they've made a stronger emphasis on a catchment-based approach. Now, this all stems from the National Ecosystem Assessment, where it was understood the value of nature to society. And some of the valuations that the National Ecosystem Assessment put into the document was that pollination to agriculture is worth around £430 million, sequestration of carbon in forests and woodlands around £680 million, and recreation £20 billion. Now, this ecosystem assessment set the scene for the government's white paper on the natural environment. And this made a really strong case for a catchment-based approach. This was then followed up by the Environment Agency's case for change, trying to understand the impacts of climate change and increasing populations on the availability of water. Now, there was a range of potential scenarios, but the Environment Agency was managed to draw a number of conclusions from the scenarios that were developed. In particular, water resources are increasingly under pressure and current abstraction rates are harming ecosystems. There's likely to be less water, climate variation, so there'll be less water available for certain species, and how they respond is going to be particularly interesting over the coming decades. But the Water White Paper emphasises the need for sort of an environmental focused approach on dealing with water in the landscape, and it stresses that a catchment-based approach is needed to address diffuse pollution in particular. So what is this catchment-based approach? It is the concept of a catchment must be considered within the hydrological or water cycle. That is how an ecosystem functions effectively. And we need to take an integrated approach to the management of all the issues that will occur within a catchment, so that we look at the whole hydrological cycle, the interaction between water quantity and water quality, the interaction between land and water, land use in particular, and the range of catchment services and the trade-offs that we need to start negotiating. What activity has more influence, interest, or benefits than another? And it's all around the concept of multiple benefits and the trade-off between polluter pays and beneficiary pays. I put this slide in the mix just to show you the complexity of integrated catchment management, the need for a systems approach. This is taken from a beginner's guide from the Australian government on how to model the interactions between catchments. Now, in Australia, it's often said that catchments are like people. You have to treat them as individuals. There's no two catchments the same. Each one will have its own geology, soil types, vegetation topography, land use capability, and land use suitability distinct to that particular catchment. And one of the things that this slide is trying to emphasize, that any one activity can have multiple impacts throughout that interconnected system. But the converse of that is, if you take a catchment scale approach, looking at it in a systems perspective, any one catchment scale action can have multiple benefits. And the multiple benefits perspective is at the center of integrated catchment management, or ICM, at the center of that slide. This is all about where different stakeholders work together to agree outcomes to achieve actions for multiple benefits. It's where different disciplines from different organizations can work together to achieve what they can't on their own. Now, currently in the Environment Agency, we are undertaking a pilot phase to determine what works best at a catchment-based approach, so we can roll this out across the country from 2013 onwards. And we're testing new ways of determining and identifying local level activities, what works best, so that we can start implementing appropriate interventions at a local scale that are reflective of the particular catchment. And to support this, we're also building an IT infrastructure to enable people to access online what it is that interests them, so they can start planning their activities from a local authority perspective or a consultant's perspective on what their particular development might mean in terms of impacts for the environment. The slide here is taken from Ofwat, the regulator for the water industry, and this is trying to emphasise what is so important about diffuse pollution. Now, according to Ofwat, diffuse pollution is the most important issue impacting the ability to manage water quality in the environment. Now, there are many sources of diffuse pollutants, and the first little picture there is particularly interested in agricultural activity. I thought I'd amend this slide for your particular audience interest, and it's all about highways and roads and the runoff from them. But the story here is essentially still the same. The impacts from diffuse pollution will then have deleterious effects on the wildlife or the habitats within a particular water body. Now, if the quality of that water reaching the water company is to the extent that they have to put in more treatments, that's then going to increase the cost to the customer. After they've put it through its treatment, there's going to be the requirement for the water company to put it back into the environment. And if there are high levels of pollutants in that water, then there's more treatment to address it, up goes the cost again. This is a vicious circle where there's an emphasis needs to be realigned onto the source of the problem. Where is the diffuse pollution coming from? Hence the need for a catchment-based approach to address the cause. So why are we here today? It's the understanding of the impacts of highways on water quality, particularly from diffuse pollution, and it is recognised that highways and roads do have a major impact on diffuse pollution into receiving water bodies in terms of quantity and quality. And we need to really start understanding where in the system from design, build and maintain should the emphasis be placed. And there is a growing appreciation of good practice in highway design. Recently, the Highways Agency put out their manual for design of roads and bridges, and they've come up with a number of documents for best practice in design. There's also a memorandum of understanding between the Highways Agency and the Environment Agency on how best to develop sustainable drainage systems, particularly from SEPA. There's a really good document on SUDs for roads. Now, there are many best practice examples that could be used in the design or retrofit of a landscape, including porous surfaces such as porous asphalt or block paving, curbs and gullies incorporating gully pots, sediment traps and oil separators, swales, as Robert mentioned earlier, using shallow vegetated channels, roadside filter drains, and storage and overland flows, particularly ponds. And there are also engineered stormwater filtration and treatment systems and bioretention systems. This is taken from the SUDs for roads from the Scottish Environment Agency example. And retrofitting in an urban setting of an existing or during reconstruction is also a good example, comes from Islington Council, where they've highlighted potential areas this is in a road junction where there's opportunities for permeable surfaces, curb extensions, and planted areas for sustainable drainage systems. So opportunities for retrofitting do exist if you got the right advice at the right time. This is an example of Longbridge in Birmingham, where watercourse improvements have been focused on an emphasis for green infrastructure. These have particular benefits, multiple benefits from a Water Framework Directive example. It's the River Ray on the western fringe of Birmingham. The scheme includes opening up of previously culverted areas and remediation of contaminated land to create a green corridor where there's all sorts of sustainable drainage examples and benefits. Another example, this is working in collaboration with the Environment Agency. This is Birmingham City Council, and it's a flood storage area with multiple benefits for water quality improvements as well. This attenuates flood flows downstream of a shopping area. This actual development includes 85,000 square feet Sainsbury's store, a car park, two new street developments in 3 phases. So I hope I've conveyed the opportunities for including green infrastructure within the urban environment, but also the need to understand how water quality and water quantity have downstream impacts, and we need to look at where the source of the problem is coming from, rather than sort of the end of pipe solution, which isn't going to be sustainable in an increasing population with all their pressures associated and a changing climate. And the Environment Agency is really keen to address this catchment scale approach in working with all stakeholders, sitting around a table with local authorities, planners, designers and developers to understand what the potential impacts might be so that we can predict potential outcomes and avoid downstream deleterious situations. What we want to do is move from this, where essentially it's a flogged landscape where there's no functioning ecosystem services or benefits, to this, where it's a fully functioning system that has multiple benefits and services for all those included. What this needs is essentially a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue, an iterative approach of collaboration between partners. And we are very keen to promote this collaborative working environment so that we can get the right people around these development or retrofitting proposals to ensure that there is consideration given to the receiving water body. It's all about the source, the pathway and the receptor. We don't want to be dealing with it when it gets to the receptor stage. We want to mitigate it at the source. Ultimately, from our perspective, it's all about water for life and livelihoods. And what I hope this slide conveys is, clean water, a clean message. It's all about the making the right improvements matter. And we'll be following up today on, there's going to be recognition that it's all about sustainable drainage systems, but it's in the right place at the right time. Thank you very much.